So now, it's my very, very special pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, FTC Commissioner Noah Phillips. He was sworn in as a commissioner on the Federal Trade Commission on May 2nd, earlier this year, and before coming to the FTC, Phillips served as chief counsel to the U.S. Senator John Cornyn of Texas on the Senate Judiciary Committee. Prior to his Senate service, Commissioner Phillips worked as a litigator at Kravis, Swain & Moore in New York City and Steptoe Johnson in Washington, D.C. So please join me in welcoming Commissioner Phillips.
Pat, thank you so much. And thanks all of you for being here with me today. I'm really pleased to be here at FOSI to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the enactment of the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, what we call COPPA. And I want to talk to you all a little bit today about that. In 1998, Congress enacted COPPA to prohibit unfair or deceptive acts or practices in connection with the collection, use, or disclosure of personally identifiable information from children on the internet. As many of you are aware, in COPPA, Congress gave the Federal Trade Commission, where I work, the responsibility for promulgating and enforcing the COPPA rule. As an FTC commissioner, I'm here today in my professional capacity to discuss children's privacy and the role that my agency plays in it. However, as a parent of 3 young children, my interest in children's privacy is personal. Scarcely a week goes by where I don't see my kids pressing on the bottom of the iPhone and asking a series of very inappropriate questions to Siri. Then they giggle. I have to admit, I giggle a lot too. But with that giggling comes a certain concern. They are interacting with technology in new and different ways, and as they grow up, they will continue to do so in ways that I may not be able to anticipate. So I'm very well aware of why we have COPPA. Even though COPPA was enacted 20 years ago, the discussion about the American approach to protecting children's privacy could not be more timely or more relevant today. As we speak, we as a nation are grappling with the challenge of consumer privacy more broadly. And I believe that our experience with COPPA, from its enactment to its implementation and enforcement, can help inform and guide these policy discussions. The FTC's involvement with children's online privacy, and indeed online privacy more generally, dates back to 1995, when we began holding a series of workshops and hearings to examine industry guidelines governing information practices online. In '98, we conducted a comprehensive online survey of information practices of commercial websites, including over 200 websites directed to children. That survey found that almost 90% of children's websites at the time were collecting personal information from and about children, including through registration pages, user surveys, online contests, electronic pen pal programs, and guest books. Children also had unfettered access to chat rooms and electronic bulletin boards, and any personal information posted there was publicly accessible to anyone on the internet. At the same time, just more than half of child-directed websites provided any statement about their information collection practices, and only 23% even told children to go get their parents' permission. A mere 1%, that's 1 out of 100, actually obtained parental permission before collecting information about children. That was industry practice. As you can imagine, these findings raise questions not only about children's privacy, but about their safety. Congress acted quickly, with then Representative, now Senator Edward Markey, and Senator Richard Bryan introducing bills in their respective chambers. Senator Bryan marveled at how swiftly Congress acted, pointing out that, quote, "In a matter of only a few months since Chairman McCain and I introduced this bill last summer, we have been able to achieve a remarkable consensus." He goes on and credited in large part to the recognition by a wide range of constituencies that this issue is an important one that requires prompt attention by Congress, end quote. Senator Bryan also recognized that the consensus was due to the input of a broad range of stakeholders. noting that revisions to the original bill were worked out carefully with the participation of the marketing and online industries, the FTC, privacy groups, and First Amendment organizations. Senator Bryan then elaborated on the goals of the legislation to enhance parental involvement in children online activities, to both protect their privacy and safety, to maintain the security of PII collected from children online, and to protect children's privacy by limiting the collection of personal information from children without their parents' consent. He concluded by pointing out that the legislation accomplishes these goals in a manner that preserves the interactivity of children's experience on the internet and preserves their access to information in this rich and valuable medium. I stress this congressional history for a couple of reasons. First, it illustrates the important role of Congress in making the tough choices when it comes to privacy and the trade-offs inherent in privacy regulation. Congress, working with its constituencies, recognized the need for legislation to protect children's privacy, and it drafted a bill. The bill, however, needed additional work. Congress did not just give the FTC carte blanche to do what it wanted. Instead, it worked with stakeholders to revise and then pass legislation that effectuated its collective intent. For example, one of the tough issues with which Congress grappled was the age of children to be covered by COPPA. The initial draft defined a child as someone under the age of 16 and anticipated even providing some attention to folks under 17. It proposed requiring verifiable parental consent for children under the age of 13, which remains a feature of COPPA today. The bill had also proposed requiring websites to use reasonable efforts to provide parents with notice and an opportunity to prevent the collection of personal information for children over the age of 12 and under the age of 17. But as commentators have pointed out, Congress ultimately recognized that this requirement had the potential to chill older minors in pursuit of information and remove the requirement in recognition of the difficult First Amendment issues that it raised. Second point, Senator Bryan's remarks also highlight another important concept. The American privacy framework that we have today is built upon identifying risks and then designing a solution that balances competing interests to address those risks. This requires evaluating the sensitivity of information and the potential harms that will result from its collection, its use, or its disclosure, and then fashioning a solution that will limit these harms while still allowing an appropriate use of even sensitive information. With COPPA, rather than trying to protect children's privacy and safety by enacting draconian legislation that could severely limit children's experience on the internet, Congress instead created a comprehensive yet flexible framework to protect both children's privacy and children's ability to access interactive content on the internet. One way that this statutory flexibility has been borne out is with respect to the requirement relating to, quote, verifiable parental consent. The statute defined verifiable parental consent as, and I'm paraphrasing here, any reasonable effort taking into consideration available technology to ensure that the parent receives notice and authorizes the collection, use, and disclosure of the child's personal information prior to any collection. In including the modifier that I stressed, taking into consideration available technology, Congress recognized that there was no perfect mechanism for obtaining parental consent, and that the cost of requiring even a close to perfect mechanism might not be justified in all cases. In drafting the first iteration of the COPPA rule, the FTC staff recognized that the cost of a technologically rigorous mechanism could sometimes outweigh its benefits, especially if there was less risk associated with the collection and use of the child's information. Accordingly, in cases where the child's information would be shared with third parties or disclosed on the internet, the rule required more stringent methods of verifiable parental consent. However, in cases where the website was not going to share or disclose the child's information, the rule provided for less costly methods of obtaining consent. This was described as a sliding scale mechanism for providing consent. It was intended actually to be a temporary option because staff and other stakeholders believed the development of technological solutions would lower the cost of obtaining parental consent. However, such mechanisms are not readily available at a reasonable cost, and the FTC ultimately made the sliding scale mechanism permanent. Importantly, they were able to engage in this cost-benefit analysis because Congress drafted the COPPA statute with this consideration in mind. This statutory flexibility has been important in other ways as well. In 1998, when Congress enacted COPPA, technology looked quite different. At that time, a major concern was that children were providing their personal information through website registration forms and surveys, or posting contact information on bulletin boards. And the first three cases that the FTC brought under the COPPA rule are illustrative of this fact. The girlslife.com website targeted girls aged 9 to 14 and offered features such as advice columns, contests, and pen pal opportunities. Partnering with bigmailbox.com and LookSmart, the Girls Life website also offered children free email accounts and online message boards. In these three cases, the FTC alleged that the defendants each collected children's full names and home addresses, email addresses, and phone numbers. And none of these websites posted privacy policies that complied with COPPA or obtained the required consent from parents before collecting the information. Again, this is beginning with girls aged 9. In 1998, social networks, smartphones, geolocation, static IP addresses were only barely on the horizon. But despite these developments and the change in the market, the flexibility of the COPPA statutory framework has ensured that the COPPA rule continues today to protect children. In 2005, the FTC conducted a review of the rule, but decided to retain it. However, in 2010, we recognized that changes to the online environment over the prior 5 years, including children's use of mobile technology to access the internet, warranted another look. The FTC reached out to stakeholders to determine whether the rule's definition of internet applied to mobile communications, interactive television, gaming, and similar activities. Staff also asked for comment on whether the rule's definition of personal information should include other items, like persistent IP addresses or mobile geolocation information, or information collected in connection with online behavioral advertising. In 2012, after a thorough notice and comment process, the FTC announced amendments to the COPPA rule, which addressed changes to the technology landscape. Among other things, the amended rule updated the definition of personal information to include geolocation, as well as photos, videos, and audio files that contain a child's image or voice. The amended rule was expanded to cover persistent identifiers that can recognize users over time and across different websites and online services, such as IP addresses or mobile device IDs. The amendments also made clear that the COPPA rule covered child-directed sites or services that integrate outside services, such as plugins or advertising networks that collect personal information from visitors. In addition, the amendments clarified that if plugins or ad networks have actual knowledge that they are collecting personal information from a child-directed website or online service, they must also comply with the rule. Recent cases against app developers illustrate how the COPPA rule continues to protect child privacy. In LAI Systems and Retro Dreamer, defendants created a number of apps directed to children, such as My Cake Shop, Marley the Talking Dog, Sneezies, and Wash the Dishes. I picked out the best one for you guys. The FTC alleged that these developers allowed third-party advertisers to collect personal information from children in the form of persistent identifiers. The app developers violated COPPA when they failed to inform the ad networks that these were child-directed apps, and they did not provide notice or get consent from parents for using or collecting that information. More recently, in VTech Electronics, the FTC brought its first case involving internet-connected toys, alleging that the company violated COPPA by collecting personal information from children without providing direct notice and obtaining their parents' consent, and failing to take reasonable steps to secure the data it collected. The United States has a proud tradition of considering and protecting privacy, dating in fact back to the founding of the Republic itself. Congress has developed our statutory scheme for consumer privacy over the last half a century, enacting statutes that cover a range of sensitive information, including children's information, financial information, health information, and so on. Congress also has legislated on if and when telemarketers can intrude on the privacy of your home. The FTC backstops these more specific risk-based rules with our general authority to protect consumers from deception and unfair practices, a flexible model that can react to new privacy risks, technologies, and market developments. This American privacy framework recognizes the trade-offs at issue in the privacy debate, balancing privacy interests with innovation and competition, and protecting most the data considered to pose the greatest risk if shared or otherwise misused. This approach, like any other, is not infallible, and reevaluation and recalibration may at times be warranted in light of changed circumstances. Nevertheless, our risk-based approach has permitted innovation, competition, and economic growth for decades. There are those who would tell you that we need to avoid using personal data at all costs, especially when it comes to children. I think that is an overly dystopian view and focuses on the possibility of harm while entirely discounting the potential promise of technologies. Instead, our approach should be one of taking care when it comes to data and also children. For example, e-learning platforms can use data to support teachers, students, and parents, creating customized lesson plans or dynamically focusing on areas that an individual student finds challenging. I see this every day in my kids' education. However, to do that, you need to use personal data. We should balance the risks and help children, parents, and educators to understand the risks. At the same time, we must also recognize where data support new technologies that serve important public goods. I would like to leave you with a few parting thoughts. First, the American approach to privacy is grounded on congressional deliberation and action. Congress is equipped to make the fundamental value judgments that privacy legislation inevitably requires. Second, when Congress takes action and enacts a privacy statute, it is our job faithfully to execute congressional will and enforce the law. This is important in all contexts, but I would argue it's especially important when it comes to protecting children. As a Federal Trade Commissioner, I consider it crucial that we continue to investigate business practices as they relate to children's privacy, and that we enforce this law as Congress intended. At the new FTC, COPPA enforcement ought to be a signature feature of our American privacy regime. Third, I'm almost done. I believe the FTC's experience with the COPPA statute and the COPPA rule can play a valuable role in informing our nation's policymaking process on privacy going forward. COPPA is a deliberately paternalistic statute because it deals with children, so it is not necessarily a model for broader privacy legislation. But despite the fact that it is 20 years old, COPPA's more flexible approach to protecting children's privacy has been critical in its continuing success and effectiveness. In considering the best ways to protect consumer privacy, we should learn from our experience with COPPA. Fourth and finally, on the general privacy front, we are going to have a big national debate because there are real policy disagreements about important issues. However, if Congress and the administration choose a particular path forward, the Federal Trade Commission is committed to undertaking the role that it is given. Thank you very much.